going there because it's an important topic. I'll say this: marriage, sexuality, and singleness, these topics that we're about to tackle in the short time that we have this morning, two things. Number one, they're universal. Anywhere and everybody that I've talked to across cultures say this: hey, pastor, you're teaching on this, but I need you to talk about marriage. I need you to talk about sexuality to my men in my culture or my women in my culture because they got it all wrong. Our whole nation or our whole culture doesn't get this. That's number one. The second thing is that the Christian church today, and maybe for some good reasons because of the public message that we have, doesn't talk about it. Not enough, or at least not clearly enough. And you know who's talking about it? Culture. It's coming through your kids' TikToks. It's coming through their IGs. It's coming everywhere. And they're learning about it. But the church doesn't have a lot to say about it because sometimes we're too afraid. When I first graduated Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in 2012, one of the first people I met was Pastor Vilas Gleski. I don't know if anybody here knows that name. Maybe, oh yeah, why do we know that name here in Sienna? Because he's one of the founding pastors of this church, and he had a huge impact on the development of our Lutheran church in the south central United States. After you graduate, you go to a room, and you sit down with the district president at that time, and in that room, he sat down with myself, my wife, and he laid out some wisdom for us. Wisdom I would never forget. Wisdom that I learned that this man was very smart, but he also knew how to communicate that to people in very succinct ways. When I got to Texas, and I became established in Austin as a pastor at that time, I ran into Pastor Gleski again, and I asked him, I said, now that I'm in Texas, am I a Texan? What did he say? Well, you got here as soon as you could. I had to think about it, and a couple minutes later, maybe a day later, I think I figured out the answer was no. And he had all of these kind of, I call them Texas Proverbs, but my associate at the time, he had written down a whole bunch of them, and he called them Gillespie-isms. Gillespie-isms. One time at pastor's conference, we were kicking it around, talking about all the false teachings in churches and all their false practices, and we were saying, well, don't do this and don't do that, and why do they teach this and why do they teach that? And you know what? Pastor Gillespie, he stood up and he said this. He said, if you walk through the barnyard too long, you're going to pick up something bad on your boots. And all of a sudden, I thought to myself, what? And all of the conversation turned to something more fruitful. He was full of wisdom, these short phrases, these Gillespie-isms, these things that were nuggets of truth that you had to wrestle with. And so later on, when we first had our kid our first child in Texas, our daughter, Blythe, I finally said to Pastor Gillespie, now is my daughter, is she a Texan? She was born here. And he said this, he said, a cat can give birth in the oven, but you don't call them buns. A day later, I figured out his answer was still no. And he was full of these. He said, he said, well, in that situation, the guy had his horse shot out from underneath him. I don't know where he picked these up, but he was full of these wisdom things. Another time he said, that guy is so closed-minded, he could look through a keyhole with both eyes. Texas Proverbs, they make you wrestle with it. They make you think. And really, when we're going through the book of Proverbs, as we are, that's what Proverbs do. Proverbs, and really the theme of Proverbs is this: you haven't thought enough about everything. You haven't thought enough about everything. Proverbs are a type of poetry in Hebrew that use parallelism. Parallelism, in our poetry, we like rhyming words. Roses are red, violets are blue, the surface of the sun is hot, and Houston is too. Right. Well, in parallelism, in Hebrew poetry, like the Proverbs and the Psalms, But especially the Proverbs, parallelism uses one thought and builds on it with another thought, and the ideas match, right? So the ideas match. Righteousness guards the way of the person of integrity, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. Proverbs 13:6. You learn from the first phrase, when you compare it to the second phrase, about what righteousness is and about what wickedness is, but you kind of chew on it longer, and you learn that a wicked person is a person who lacks integrity. But just like Gillespieisms, you have to think about it. They're also vivid, and that's what I'm warming up to today, because we're going to have some very vivid ideas that are put out there. So, a beautiful but foolish woman is like a gold ring in the snout of a pig. Proverbs 11:22. Think about that one. It might put a smile on your face if you do. Or another one that's very vivid. I was just talking about this one earlier this week with somebody that had poured vinegar through their coffee maker. I know you're in here, Pastor Boschek. A lazy employee is like vinegar to the teeth. Oh, you kind of shiver when you think about that. They're vivid. And they're true. So that's why we're going through them, and that's why we're going to talk about this phrase that we have before us today. And it could be uncomfortable, and it could light you up, and it should light you up. One very popular commentator on the book of Proverbs wrote a devotional, and in the beginning he said, the Psalms are like a healing balm for the skin. When you get sunburned, you want to put that aloe on it to make it feel good. That's what the Psalms are like. They're like a healing, they're a way to express your emotions before God. Proverbs, he says, if the Bible is a medicine cabinet, Psalms are the healing ointment, Proverbs are the smelling salts. They wake you up. They're the triple shot of espresso in the morning to get you going. So let's go. We're going to get going on the Proverbs about sexuality and about marriage. And if you're tuning in right now, online or in person, you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm single, so this doesn't have any. Oh, no. This has everything to do with you, whether you're married, divorced, single, or looking to be married. Proverbs 5-7 covers marriage and sexuality, and this book was also used as a primer for young men. So that's often why you hear the proverbist saying this. He's saying, son, man, young man, don't do this, do that. Young women, when you're in the room right now, don't think that just because he's saying that, he's only referring to young men. He's talking to you too. So this is a message for everybody. It's a universal message. There's a huge need. We're going to get into it. The Proverbs are like a smelling salt to startle you into alertness, number one. Number two, we learn from Proverbs 5:15-20, that the reality of life is that there are seductive allures. Verse 15, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow into the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. My son, why be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? This is written at a time and a place where people owned, or they had land, and it was dry and it was arid. So, you had a well, and the precious water that you had on your well, on your land, that pure water was your own. It was meant for your family. It was meant for your wife. It was meant for your children. It was meant for your workers. It was meant for your animals. People today are talking about how fresh water is becoming a precious commodity in our world. Back then, even more so. So if you were to go across the line of your neighbor and go and steal his water, what did that mean? Them were fighting words. Going into his well taking the precious thing that he uses to provide for his family. Keep your water to yourself, the Proverbs is saying. Don't be going to your neighbor. Don't be taking their fresh water. Don't be putting them into a situation that puts their family at risk. But that's what you're doing when you go and you steal their water. That's what's happening when somebody comes onto your property. In Texas, if you came onto somebody's property without permission, good idea, bad idea? Bad idea. That's what the Proverbs is saying. That's the picture, that's the vivid picture that he's using when he says this, drink water from your own cistern. Let them be yours and yours alone. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? You're putting his family, his life, his commitment that he made to her at risk. And that's a dangerous thing. The seductive allure of sin is the reality that we live in. To live your best life, God-centered life, is to play by God's game plan for marriage. Now, well, what is God's game plan for marriage? You have to check Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, God, on the sixth day of creation, he creates man and woman. But he creates man first. He takes him out of the dust of the ground. He breathes into him life. And then he gives the man an experiment. He says to the man, name all of the animals. I'm going to bring them to you. You're going to give them names. And he does. And when he gives them names, he notices something. He says, everybody's paired up. Everybody has one that's male and one that's female. But he noticed through the experiment, and that's why God, I believe, did this, is that through the experiment, God helped him notice something. There wasn't a pair for him. There wasn't somebody that matched him like all of the other creatures matched the other creatures. And he became lonely. Isn't that interesting? And God said, that's right that you're lonely, and you're not going to be complete until you have another part to you. And that other part of you makes you complete, makes you your strength, makes you your whole. And then he created, out of the side of the man, the woman. And the two, it says, became one flesh. So God created a one flesh relationship that he would use to build society, that he would use to build homes, that he would use to build a place where children would be born and populate the earth, and that societies would thrive. And it started with a one flesh relationship and a commitment to one another that marriage was instituted. Not by some people in caves that decided this would be a good idea, but by God himself from in heaven. You hear that? It's not an evolution thing. It's a God-ordained thing. And God put man and woman together in order for them to have a commitment. And from that commitment, they would share a one-flesh relationship. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become what? Become what? Thank you. One flesh. Out of that, we find the reason for sexuality. It happens within a one flesh committed relationship. So men, are you letting your water run? Turn it off. Keep it to yourself. Keep it out of the public square. Are you letting that water drip into websites that you shouldn't be at? Are you letting that water drip into people at your workplace that are not part of your one flesh relationship that you've made permanent through a commitment that you made at the altar before God and all people, and you put a ring on it? Don't let that water drip. That's what the Proverbs is saying. Drink water from your own cistern. Should they overflow into the public square? And I understand this. The Proverbs says specifically in verse 18, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. I'm not going to read the next verses again. You heard them once, and you understand what he's saying. Are you thinking today, after 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after marriage, that you can go after the next edition without forgetting the wife of your youth? And I understand that time takes a toll on the human body, and so does birth. And the wrinkles set in. And she doesn't look like she used to. Have you forgotten the wife of your youth? She was a 10 out of 10 when you married her. She's your 10 out of 10 today, too, because your marriage is based not on how you feel, but on the commitment that you made. And women, I understand. His belt has grown a couple sizes since that day. He was your Prince Charming. He's your 10 out of your 10. And the wrinkles set in, and the gray hairs set in. And maybe he's not as charming as he used to be. Because you know how charming he was when he was pursuing you. And that charm could wear off as the stress of, well, work and life, raising kids, happens. Are you letting your water spill because you're getting attention, affirmation, and love from others at your work or in your community that he's not giving you? Something deep that you've been desiring from him that he's just not providing? Have you forgotten the husband of your youth? Verse 18. And now I want to speak as a father. I'm going to lay this down. It's not natural for me to do this, but I'm going to try to speak to you, young men and women. The proverbist is low-key saying, you're laughing already. Well, you know I'm trying up here, right? He's saying, when you're scrolling through your IGs and your TikTok, and you're posting or you're picking up some sus pics or videos, you know that's not vibing. Not vibing with your rents underneath your roof or the big rent above. So knock it off. Fur? And that goes for your drip as well. Don't be spilling that into the public square. Because if you're spilling that into the public square, what you're saying is that you're really not you. You're just taking your cues from the people that you're seeing online. And you're saying that's what it means to be a real man. That's what it means to be a real woman. But that's not true. And don't be spilling your tea or sipping your tea with your bae unless your bae is your forever person. How do you make them your forever person? Well, you put a ring on it. That's your ring person now, your forever person. Bet? And you're going to keep them your forever person. And you think this is just boomer talk, but the proverbist said it, so you can read it in Proverbs chapter 5. I got through it. And I want you parents to think about that. Not that you have to say it to your kids that way, but understand that your kids are going through the same things that you went through as a kid. But today, there's a full-on attack by the devil. And he's changing people's minds about sexuality. And he's changing people's minds about what it means to have a committed relationship. And I want you to say that to your grandkids. I want you to say that to your kids. And I want you to speak truth into their life because it's true. And because a life that is the best life, centered on Jesus, is a life where marriages are thriving. And there's so many seductive allures in the world today. God created a one-flesh union at creation. So the big idea is this: don't be spilling. Don't be spilling into other people's lives. Don't be spilling what was meant for that one flesh relationship with strangers in the public chat. Which brings us to the next point. The reality we live in is that we put our own happiness and our own contentment above God's plans, and that's destructive enough because when infidelity happens, it destroys families, it destroys homes, it destroys trust between the children and the parents, and questions. It has a whole bunch of destructive consequences, but the deepest consequence that's happening with lust, pornography, sexuality outside of marriage has to do with a deeper problem. The reality of the destructive consequence we find in Proverbs chapter 5, 21 to 23. For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sins hold them fast. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly. The late storyteller and American leader at his time and his place, because he had a huge voice and influence, Paul Harvey. Now that's a boomer name. No? Okay. I was surprised. Maybe I thought a couple more people would know that name. Anyways, he used to be on the radio, and he used to tell stories, and this is one of his stories, okay? A tribe of Eskimos were threatened by a dangerous wolf pack, and so they made a trap. What was the trap? Well, they took a hunting knife and they covered it in blood, and then they froze it. And then they covered it in blood again, and they froze it again. And then they took that knife and they placed it in the ground securely, blade up. The wolf from many miles away could begin to smell the blood, and so it approached. And what did it begin to do? It began to lick a blood popsicle. And it would lick, and it would lick, and it tasted good, and it was really pleasing, and the wolf became intoxicated. That's the word, right? Intoxicated with the smell of the blood that it was licking, until what happened? Its tongue got cut. And now the blood began to mix with the animal blood, and it didn't really notice because it was so tasty, and it kept licking and licking and licking and licking until it became weak, until it's lost so much blood that it fell onto the trap itself, killing itself. Did I mention that Proverbs are smelling salts? Time to wake up. I don't think that you can have any stronger language than we just heard right now. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sins hold them fast. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly. So the consequences of adultery, the consequences of letting your water spill into other people's lives, water that should be reserved for that one flesh relationship, is dangerous enough. Broken homes, broken families, distress between couples. But the real problem is something that's happening in the heart. Larry Crabb, in his famous book, Inside Out, he talks about this. He talks about the iceberg. An iceberg represents, in his studies, two things. Number one, the stuff on top of the iceberg represents the things that are present, the things that we feel, the things that we see, the things that we express, the things that the people around us can see us feel and express. They are the behaviors, the conscious thoughts, and the feelings. But the things below the waterline are the attitudes and the motives and the purposes of the heart. They're also the painful memories and emotions from the past that we didn't realize were there. And if you worked with young people, or if you worked with people in general on a professional level, you'll know that what's the most important thing to get to? It's the stuff beneath the iceberg. And he argues in his book that the gospel is meant to transform everything beneath the waterline. But men, when you go to those websites, or women that go to those websites, what's that really saying? Not just about your actions, but what's it saying about your heart? Women, when you run to him, that strange man that's not your husband, for affirmation and love, what's that really saying about what's beneath the waterline? There's something wrong with the heart. That's why Jesus, when he got into a heated exchange with the Pharisees, the leading pastor class of that time, in Matthew chapter 15, the Pharisees would say, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to live a life, and you have to present yourself that has a righteousness before God. And their whole thing was everything above the waterline. They said, if you keep this, if you eat that and you don't eat that, then you're going to be pure. You're going to be good in God's eyes and before man. But Jesus turned it on its head, and he said, no. It's everything beneath the waterline that God cares about. The place that the gospel and God's love should transform you. And so in Matthew 15:11, Jesus says this, what goes into a man's mouth does not make him unclean, Jesus said, but what comes out of his mouth, that is what makes him unclean. He's talking about the heart, because out of the heart the mouth speaks. That's another way to say he's saying that. And later on in Matthew chapter 23, he says, "Woe to you teachers of the laws and you Pharisees and you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. First, clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will be clean also." So parents, when you tell your kids to wash the dishes, and they just take a washcloth and wash the outside and put it back in the cabinet, is that going to fly in your house? Jesus says the inside needs to be clean, and the real problem with us when is we run after other people and we have those thoughts and we have those attitudes is really a problem with the inside. And you can clean up and become morally correct and even put covenant eyes on your browsers, and you can make rules for yourself, but what really needs to happen in order to really be fixed is for the inside to be cleaned. How are we going to do that? Who's going to do that? I'm not powerful enough. And that's where Jesus and his pure water comes in to clean me from the inside out, to clean you from the inside out. Because the reality that we live in is that Jesus has pure water, and Jesus' water is the water that can clean us. What do I mean by that? Well, in John chapter 4, Jesus makes a point, it says. He says he must go through Samaria, and he meets a strange woman. A strange woman who is filling her life with affirmation and love and attention by strange men, letting her water spill into the town square because she thought she was filling her life up with what she really needed. But you know what? She was thirsty. Her mouth was dry. She was at the well, and so Jesus approaches her at this well in Samaria, and he introduces himself in middle of the day. Probably some commentators say she's there because she's ashamed. She's ashamed of her life. And you either go in the morning or you go in the evening. But she goes in the middle of the day, so nobody can see her. So her life is filled with shame. And you know right away that there's something below the waterline that's happening. Jesus goes up to her and says, "Give me a drink." And she says, "Why are you asking me for a drink?" First of all, it's taboo for a man to talk to a woman in that day and age. And second of all, they're bitter enemies. They're rivals. The Jews and the Samaritans. Jesus a Jew, she a Samaritan. "Why are you talking to me?" And he says, "If you knew who you're talking to, you would ask me for a drink. And I'll give you some water where you'll never have to come back to this well again." And she says, maybe sarcastically, "Yeah, give me some of that water. Then I don't have to come back to this darn well ever again." Jesus says, "First, go and get your husband." "I have no husband," she said. "You're right," Jesus replied. "You have no husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the one man that you're with now, he's not your husband either." And all of a sudden, she realized she wasn't just talking to anybody, she was talking to a man of God. And later in that conversation, she realized she was talking to the one that knew her through and through. He knew her beneath the waterline. "For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths." Jesus went below the waterline with her to cleanse her, to take away her shame. He went there to that place where he saw everything and knew everything, everywhere she'd been, everything that she did. Men, women, singles, Jesus goes beneath your waterline, and he knows everywhere you've been, everything you've done, but he knows more than that. He knows the emotions of the heart and the desires and the attitudes about why you went there. Looking for affirmation, looking for love, looking for the false gold that the world gives. Underneath the waterline, Jesus saw this. he saw that you're running after some love and affirmation that you can only receive from God, that can only be filled by him. And you're trying to find it with all the wrong people in all the wrong places. And you might think he's going there to crush. He's going there to destroy. He's going there to condemn. But I have good news. He goes there to forgive. If you drink of this water, Jesus says, it's going to be a spring welling up to eternal life. Because his eyes never went there. His heart and his attitudes always remained pure. And he gave his perfect, pure life on the cross in order to give you his water. His water in order for you to thrive and be forgiven and to have everything underneath the waterline wiped clean. And that's the way that you stand before God in your marriage, in your singleness, in your sexuality. G.K. Chesterton famously said that every man that knocks at the door of a brothel is looking for God. And I have friends that struggle with alcoholism as well. They say something similar. They were looking for God at the bottom of a bottle. My friends, you're not going to find the solution there. You're going to find the place that you find Jesus is in his word. You're going to find Jesus in the living water that woman had is going to transform your life. And when it transforms your life from the inside out, it's going to transform your marriage. It's going to make you think about the deep richness of your identity as a single person. It's going to make you think harder than the Proverbs will make you think about life. What happened when that woman was forgiven by Jesus? Where did she go? What did she do? Do you remember the end of the story? Talking about Paul Harvey. What was the rest of the story? She kept it to herself, right? No. She had to tell others. She ran back into the marketplace, the place where she had spilled her water time and time again, and she told everyone about Jesus. She couldn't help it. Maybe even to the 5, the 6 men that she had committed adultery with, perhaps they even came to Jesus, but she said this, I have some tea to spill. I have some news for everyone here. The man I just talked to, he knew me beneath the waterline. He knew me all the way through, and he forgave me, and he's come to forgive you too. So run to him, and the Samaritans did. So my friends, do you know somebody that's living in shame? Maybe they won't even darken the door of a church because of their shame. Maybe it's a sexual thing, or maybe it's another thing. Do you know that Jesus takes away shame? I just read this quote this weekend. It was great. It was talking about why we reach out to people, and it really has to do with the inside-out change. Church leader said this, growth in a Christian community can happen without revival, without the inside change. But when the inside change happens, when revival happens, there is some sort of growth in the Christian community. You know why? Because people that have been transformed by the gospel can't help but tell their neighbor. They have to spit it. They have to spill it. That's what this woman is doing. She's spilling it all over the place, not her body, but the news of Jesus, because it's the greatest news that wiped away her shame. It's the greatest news that wipes away your and my shame. So we have to tell others. We want to tell others because it's the greatest news. Husbands, the greatest news is what you model in the home. And Ephesians chapter 5, in conclusion, think about this. Jesus says, husbands, you're like Jesus in your home. Jesus gave his life. Jesus was a leader who was a servant. Jesus poured everything into his mission to love his people, even giving his life on the cross. So you have a leadership role in the family to say, this body of mine, this mind, my commitment for better and worse through sickness and in health, I've given it to her and I've committed it. That's what it means to be a real man. And that's who Jesus has created you to be and to model to your wife and to your children. And the same goes for wives. You've been created for that husband to give your mind and your body and your soul and everything that you have to pour into him and make him the real man that he is, if you've committed yourself to that relationship through marriage, that means that you're in it forever. You're in it till death do us part. And you are the one in his life that gives him, just like the church gives Jesus respect, you're going to give him respect. And then now you're going to be thinking, but he didn't deserve respect because he's a sinner. And that's true. And you husbands might be, he doesn't deserve love because I don't feel respected. What happens then? You're two sinners that return back to him. The perfect husband who is pure for you both. And if you hang around with us long enough here at Divine Savior Sienna, we'll dig deeper into that conversation in Connect groups. And if you're single, I want to say one more thing about if you're single. The Bible says you don't have to get married. You don't have to put yourself into that relationship that binds you with another person. So single people, think about this. Think critically about this. Some of the happiest people in the Bible remained single. Jesus, Paul. They knew that their identity wasn't about whether they had to get hitched or not. Their identity was with God above first, which made a healthier relationship with God in many cases. I'm not saying all cases, because Paul speaks highly of marriage and he speaks highly of singleness. And he says, I would prefer many of you in this day and age to remain single. But be single for the right reasons. And if you can't, and you feel like you need to spill that water, Paul says, get married, then spill it. The reality we live in is that sin is real. Seduction is strong in today's culture. The reality we live in today is that it's destructive. Not just destructive to marriages or to families or to kids, but it's destructive to the heart because the devil wants to pull us away from God. But the reality is this, is that we have Jesus' clean, pure water, my friends. So drink up and spill the gospel as you share it with your friends, neighbors, and community. Bet?